Tonight we drift north, to a city built on smoke, snow, and silence. Where the river between two nations once carried more than water. Carried secrets. Here, under the mist of Niagara, a quiet Sicilian undertaker turned funerals into front lines, and whispers into power. He never ruled with gunfire. He ruled with absence. A calm so deep that men forgot to breathe in his presence. For half a century Buffalo slept beneath his hand. No headlines. No noise. Just the steady hum of money crossing the river, and the faint scent of lilies from his funeral home on Niagara Street. His name was Stefano Magaddino. To the city he was the Undertaker. To history he became something larger. The architect of a silent empire. Close your eyes. Let the current pull you back. To the river. To the fog. To the story that never raised its voice, but never truly stopped speaking. This is the Silent Empire. A sleep documentary about power, patience, and the sound of silence itself. The wind along the Niagara River has a way of carrying secrets. Some nights it hums like a lullaby over the steel bridges. Other nights it whispers names long forgotten, names that once made even the hardest men lower their voices. Buffalo, New York. Winter of 1921. The city sleeps beneath a blanket of slow-falling snow, and somewhere near the river's edge, a man in a long black coat stands watching the water drift south, toward a nation thirsty for something forbidden. His name is Stefano Magaddino. To the neighbors who pass his modest funeral home on Niagara Street, he is the quiet Sicilian undertaker, courteous, soft-spoken, devout. To a few others, men who meet him in dimly lit back rooms above bakeries or in the basements of fraternal lodges, he is Don Stefano, the man who moves what no one else dares move. Whiskey. Brandy. Secrets. The smell of the river is sharp tonight. Cold metal, wood smoke, and a faint sweetness from a distillery across the Canadian shore. Stefano listens to the rhythm of the current as if it were a metronome guiding his life. He has learned to time everything by silence. A pause before a sentence, a prayer before a favor, a look before an order. Silence to him is a language older than law. He didn't always live by the water. He came from a place where the sea itself was an old god, Castellamare del Golfo, Sicily, a town of salt and superstition. He grew up among fishermen who prayed more than they smiled, and among men who learned early that respect was life and talk was death. When violence came to his family, a cousin murdered in a vendetta that spiraled through the narrow stone alleys, Stefano understood the rule that would define him. The fewer words a man used, the longer he lived. When he arrived in America at the turn of the century, he carried little more than that rule and a black suit that would later serve him well. He worked first in Brooklyn, then in Buffalo, a city colder than anything Sicily had ever offered but alive with opportunity. The Italians here were bricklayers, dockworkers, laborers who sang folk songs at dusk and drank cheap wine from chipped mugs. But there was another world beneath that surface. Men who spoke of shipments, passwords, alliances reaching from New York to Chicago to Toronto. The old clans had come with them, disguised as neighborhood groups, mutual aid societies, and church patrons. By day Stefano tended to the dead. By night, he tended to the living who wished to remain unseen. His funeral parlor was small, perfumed with lilies and wax, yet the back room smelled of oak barrels and wet rope. He understood that a hearse could carry more than caskets. In the age of Prohibition it carried fortune. Across the river the Canadian breweries had turned into gold mines. Liquor was legal there, illegal here, and between the two flowed miles of icy opportunity. Others tried the trade and failed, caught, shot, or simply too loud. But Magaddino's genius was quiet logistics. He treated smuggling like a sacrament, planned, measured, and done with solemn respect. Each crate of whiskey was catalogued like a soul entrusted to him. Each driver was reminded that silence was salvation. The priests in certain parishes blessed not only the dead but the trucks themselves. It was business, yes, but it was also ritual. The first time he crossed into Ontario under the moon's thin light, the river half frozen, he felt no fear. Only calculation. He memorized every bend, every whisper of the current against rock. Later, his men would build floating platforms disguised as ice drifts. They would push them across with long poles, guiding barrels beneath blankets of snow. The border agent saw only winter's stillness. By dawn, the barrels were stacked neatly in Buffalo cellars, waiting to be reborn as celebration in speakeasies from Michigan to Manhattan. As profits rose, so did his circle of allies. There were men from Cleveland, Detroit, and Montreal, each bringing their own shade of ambition. But none possessed Stefano's patience. He never chased headlines, never sat in the front row of a church, never smiled for the local paper. He let others crave attention, He craved control. His men called him Il Becchino, the Undertaker, and though some said it half in jest, all meant it with reverence. He buried problems, literally and figuratively. The city's other ethnic gangs fought noisily over scraps. The Irish controlled parts of the docks, the Polish guarded their wards, but the Sicilians worked like shadows under the snow. When a rival bootlegger attempted to undercut his shipments, the man's warehouse burned quietly one night, the flames blue and steady, the firemen arriving too late to save anything. No witnesses. No retaliation. Only silence, and a week later, a donation to the local orphanage from Mr. S. Magaddino, funeral director. Buffalo during those years was a city between worlds. Factories belched smoke by day, jazz spilled from basements by night. Men wore fedoras tilted low, and women danced until the snow outside turned pink from sunrise. Yet beneath the rhythm of saxophones and engines, there was always the hum of fear, a knowledge that unseen hands moved everything that mattered. Liquor, labor, votes, even funerals. Magaddino's funeral home became a sanctuary of negotiation. No one dared record or repeat what was said among the embalming tables. When deals were struck, they were sealed over the scent of formaldehyde and roses. Death, after all, reminded men of consequences. It made promises sacred. One evening in 1925, as sleet struck the windows, two men from Chicago arrived unannounced. They were dressed like bankers but carried the tension of soldiers. They spoke of coordination, of dividing territories, of alliances that could span the Great Lakes. Stefano listened more than he spoke. When he did answer, his words were few, his eyes unreadable. That night, Buffalo quietly joined the map of what newspapers would one day call the American Mafia. But no journalist ever saw the ink dry. To outsiders, Magaddino's power seemed invisible. No parades, no killings in daylight, no garish displays of wealth. Yet every shipment, every contract, every accident, carried his signature of stillness. The workers of Local 210, the laborers' union, began to whisper his name with a mixture of respect and fear. Construction contracts, bridge repairs, even cemetery expansions, all somehow linked back to the Undertaker who never raised his voice. At church on Sundays, he knelt like any other man, his head bowed, his lips moving in silent prayer. But even there, silence served him. Confession was the only room in Buffalo where words disappeared by rule. Priests heard the sins of dockworkers and ward bosses alike, and though they spoke no names, Stefano often knew which men required forgiveness beyond the spiritual kind. When debts couldn't be paid in money, they were paid in loyalty. The river became his confessional too. On sleepless nights, he walked its banks, the fog wrapping him like an old friend. He would pause, staring at the opposite shore, lights blinking faintly through mist. Canada, source of his fortune, mirror of his fate. He thought of Sicily, of the cliffs where he'd once watched fishermen vanish into storms, and realized America's storms were quieter but deadlier. Here, a man drowned in greed long before he touched water. By 1929, Prohibition had turned millionaires out of morticians. Magaddino's organization moved liquor by the ton, heroin by the ounce, and respect by the whisper. He purchased a mansion on Delaware Avenue, though he insisted it remain unlisted. Neighbors described him as courteous, always punctual, always somber. They rarely saw visitors. Only hearses came and went, sometimes 2, sometimes 3 in a single night. No one asked whose funerals they served. The stock market crashed that October. Factories closed, banks folded, and yet Stefano's empire thrived. Desperation bred dependence. Men needed work and Local 210 provided it, at a price. Politicians needed campaign funds and envelopes appeared on cue. The police needed peace and they received it as long as they respected boundaries. Buffalo stayed quieter than most cities during the Depression, and many said it was because the Undertaker loved peace. Few dared suggest it was because he demanded it. Still, even the calmest river hides turbulence below. Rumors spread of internal feuds, of younger men too ambitious, too reckless. One night, a shipment vanished on the Canadian side. 2 weeks later, a fisherman found a body snagged beneath the ice, its hands folded neatly on its chest as if prepared for burial. When the police arrived, the Undertaker himself offered to handle the arrangements free of charge. He ensured the coffin was sealed before delivery. Outside the funeral home, children played in the snow, tossing clumps against the black cars parked nearby. They had no idea that history idled behind those tinted windows. Inside, Stefano stood before a mirror adjusting his tie, his reflection ghost-like in the dim light. He thought of how far silence had carried him. Silence and the river, Two forces that never stopped moving, never announced themselves, never needed permission. He knew every empire begins the same way, not with war but with a whisper. And if you listen closely enough to the Niagara on those long frozen nights, you could almost hear that whisper forming into a promise of dominion bought with patience, fear, and quiet devotion. To the city he was merely the Undertaker. But to the men who crossed that river with him under moonlight, he was already something else, the architect of a silent empire. And so, while the rest of America shouted, drank, and danced through the final roar of the Jazz Age, Buffalo remained still. A city half asleep, guarded by a man who believed the less noise power made, the longer it lasted. Beneath its bridges, beneath its snow, beneath its prayerful calm, the Undertaker listened to the hum of his kingdom, steady, relentless, eternal as the river itself. Next time we'll drift back across the Atlantic, to the sun-bleached alleys of Sicily, where vengeance was born and silence first learned to speak. That is where Stefano's story truly began. Before the river, before Buffalo, before the hum of engines and the smell of gasoline, there was the sea. The Tyrrhenian Sea, its breath salt-heavy and ancient, breaking against the cliffs of Castellamare del Golfo. That was where the boy who would one day be called the Undertaker learned the first and only language he would ever truly trust: silence. In the early 1890s, Castellamare was a town caught between sunlight and hunger. By morning the fishermen dragged in nets glittering with sardines. By evening the same men drank wine thick as blood and spoke of taxes, feuds, and fate. Every stone alley echoed with the cries of vendors and the murmurs of saints. Children chased stray dogs through archways blackened by centuries of smoke. And somewhere between church bells and the sea's roar, young Stefano Magaddino absorbed a lesson that would outlast the island itself. Words could kill faster than blades. His father, a carpenter with hands like cracked leather, rarely raised his voice. His mother whispered prayers into every loaf she baked. They lived in a one-room house above the harbor, its window facing the masts that bobbed like bare crosses in the tide. At night the boy would lie awake listening to the ocean strike the rocks below. It sounded like breath, endless, patient, unstoppable. In those days Sicily was ruled not so much by law as by memory. A wrong done to one man echoed through generations. Forgiveness was considered weakness. Justice was personal. If a neighbor insulted your name, you waited for the right night and settled the insult in darkness. If a stranger asked questions, you shrugged and said you'd seen nothing. This unspoken covenant had no written code, no scripture, only habit and fear. Later men would call it omerta. Stefano simply called it survival. He was 8 the first time he saw a corpse not laid out for mass. A man from the next quarter, throat opened ear to ear, left slumped beside a citrus grove. The adults spoke in riddles. They said the man had forgotten himself. No one explained what that meant, but the boy noticed how even the priests avoided the widow's eyes. Death in Sicily was never anonymous. It always belonged to someone's story, but the story itself was never told. At 12, he began helping his uncle at the small workshop near the docks, carrying wood, sweeping sawdust, fetching nails. The uncle did more than build furniture, he built favors. Men came seeking advice, loans, forgiveness. Stefano watched them enter nervous and leave grateful, their pockets lighter but their futures secured. It was his first glimpse of power wrapped in kindness. His uncle called it helping friends. Years later the newspapers would call it extortion. The truth, Stefano decided, was somewhere in between. Every Sunday they attended Mass at the Church of Santa Maria del Soccorso, its bells tolling over the bay. The statues of saints gleamed with candle smoke. The Virgin's eyes, dark and unblinking, seemed to witness everything men refused to confess. Stefano knelt beside his mother, repeating the Latin phrases by memory. But as he grew older he began to wonder which sins truly mattered, those against God or those against family. One summer evening, a quarrel broke out between two cousins over an unpaid debt. The older one, Tommaso, was quick-tempered and proud. The younger, Pietro, favored laughter and long silences. Stefano idolized Pietro. They fished together, shared secrets, dreamt of leaving the island. But one morning Pietro's boat returned without him. Tommaso claimed it was an accident. No one believed him. The village pretended to mourn, yet the air vibrated with expectation. A week later Tommaso's body washed ashore, weighted with stones. No investigation followed. The priest spoke of the Lord's mysterious will, the people nodded. And Stefano, barely 15, felt something cold settle into his heart, a certainty that the world ran on silence more than faith. Months later, a knock came at the family door. 2 men dressed in dark wool stood there, hats low, voices low. They spoke to his father, then to him. They asked if he'd seen anything, heard anything, known anything about the quarrel. Stefano said only 3 words, "Io non so, I don't know." It was enough. The men exchanged a glance of approval, patted his shoulder and left. His father closed the door and exhaled slowly. "Remember that," he said. "In this life the one who talks dies first." Through the next few years the island changed little. Kings rose and fell, police arrived and disappeared, but the code endured. When earthquakes shook the coast, the people prayed and rebuilt. When bandits robbed travelers, the villagers hid them instead of reporting them. The government was far away. Honor was close. And every young man learned that to survive in Sicily, you must become both invisible and indispensable. Stefano's invisibility made him useful. He delivered messages for men he didn't know, carried envelopes sealed with wax, and was told never to open them. He never did. He noticed who met after dark at the taverna near the church, who paid for whose wine, who suddenly left town after a shooting. He understood that the island breathed through 1,000 invisible lungs, each inhaling secrecy and exhaling fear. By 19 he had mastered the rhythm. By 20 he wanted more than rhythm, he wanted escape. Opportunity came disguised as mourning. An uncle in America had written, offering him work at a funeral home in Brooklyn. The old man needed someone who spoke Italian, someone trustworthy. Stefano didn't ask what that meant. He only knew that ships left Palermo every month for New York, and that those who boarded them rarely came back. He kissed his mother's hands, promised to send money, and watched the coastline fade behind the ship's stern like a closing eyelid. The voyage was long and gray. Third-class passengers slept in narrow bunks that stank of salt and sickness. Children cried, old women prayed, men played cards by candlelight. At night Stefano stood on deck, staring west into the black Atlantic. The stars there seemed different, colder, freer. He thought of Pietro, of Tommaso, of the men in dark coats, and wondered if America had its own version of silence. When the ship reached Ellis Island, the air smelled of coal and bread. He passed inspection easily, young, healthy, unreadable. The clerk asked for his occupation. "Carpenter," he replied. The word felt both true and false. He carried tools in his bag, but also something invisible. The Sicilian code, coiled tight inside him like a rosary of steel. Brooklyn was noise. Streetcars, shouting vendors, jazz from open windows, the clang of hammers on steel. For a moment, the boy from Castellamare felt drowned in sound. Yet beneath that chaos, he sensed the same undercurrent he'd known all his life. Men doing business in whispers, favors traded under the sign of the cross. He met others from the old country. Bananos, Buffalinos, Bascianos, names that would one day fill headlines though none could imagine it yet. They gathered in back rooms of bakeries, drank espresso, spoke softly of the old ways. And when disputes arose, they were settled privately, quietly, permanently. Stefano's first job in Brooklyn was indeed at a funeral home. He swept floors, polished coffins, learned to dress the dead with dignity. The owner, another Sicilian, taught him that grief was a kind of business, predictable, steady, profitable. Funerals, like favors, never went out of season. And death, handled properly, earned respect. The boy's calm nature suited the work. He could stand beside the bereaved for hours, listening without speaking, offering comfort through presence alone. It was here that silence became more than survival, it became art. Rumors traveled faster than hearses. Within a year he was known among the local paesani as reliable, discreet, unflinching. He was invited to dinners where the talk grew quieter as the night deepened. He learned to pour wine without spilling, to watch faces instead of words, to read agreements written only in glances. When trouble flared between rival Sicilian factions, Stefano remained neutral, serving both funerals with equal grace. Even men who hated each other trusted him with their dead. That, he understood, was real power. Then came the telegram. His cousin Antonio, who had left Sicily months after him, had been gunned down in Buffalo during a dispute over shipping routes on Lake Erie. The message was brief, almost clinical, but between the lines he recognized the handwriting of fate. Buffalo, another frontier, another river, another chance to build something lasting. He finished the funeral he was working, packed his black suit, and boarded a northbound train. As the train rolled through New York State, snow began to fall outside the windows. White fields blurred into forests, rivers froze into silver ribbons. He thought of the sea back home, the one that had taught him to listen. Now another body of water awaited him, colder but familiar in its secrecy. When he finally stepped off the train at Buffalo's Exchange Street station, the air cut like glass. Men shouted about work at the docks, about wages and whiskey. Somewhere nearby, the river whispered beneath the ice. Stefano smiled faintly. He understood the sound. He had heard it all his life. The Sicilian code had crossed an ocean with him. It would guide his hands as he built a new kind of empire, not with speeches or banners, but with patience, precision, and the same silence that once ruled the alleys of Castellamare del Golfo. And though America believed itself louder, freer, more modern, he knew better. Every land, no matter how new, eventually learns to respect the old silence. That night, as he walked toward the small boarding house where his cousin had once lived, snow creaked under his shoes. The city smelled of coal and whiskey. He looked up at the smoke rising from the chimneys and thought of incense drifting in Sicilian churches. Different sky, same prayers. Different country, same code. He whispered one line into the cold. Never speak. Never forget. Then he disappeared into the falling snow. A man shaped by an island's ghosts, carrying a code the world would one day fear. A code that would turn the quiet banks of the Niagara into the heart of a silent empire. Next time, we'll drift into the restless glow of the American 1920s, when liquor became gold and silence became power. The river never slept. Even when the surface froze, something beneath it moved, slow, steady, unbroken. By the winter of 1920, America had made a strange promise to itself. It would become sober. The government had outlawed the bottle, believing it could outlaw desire. But desire, like a river, only needed another path. Stefano Magaddino stood at the edge of the Niagara that winter, watching chunks of ice drift like ghosts. He had been in Buffalo barely a year, but already the city felt familiar. The weather here bit through coats, but it also carved men sharp. Factories hissed through snow. Ships groaned against the docks. Somewhere downtown, a jazz trumpet cried out over laughter muffled behind shuttered doors. Prohibition had arrived, and with it, opportunity measured not in bottles but in silence. He began small. A few crates ferried from Ontario, hidden among cargo labeled glassware. A priest's blessing on both sides of the border. A handful of drivers who spoke little English but knew every back road between Niagara Falls and Buffalo. No flash, no fights. Just quiet efficiency. While others celebrated quick money with loud speakeasies and gaudy cars, Stefano treated the business like a mass. Solemn, ritualized, unspoken. His funeral home expanded subtly. A second hearse acquired, 2 new assistants hired. To most eyes, business looked good for an honest undertaker. Few wondered why so many deliveries came at midnight. The men who worked for him called it holy cargo. Each night they crossed the bridge into Ontario, where barrels waited under snow-stained tarps. Each morning they returned before dawn, engines barely humming, the air thick with frost and secrecy. When they unloaded, Stefano watched from the doorway, coat collar up, breath clouding in the dark. He never touched the merchandise. He didn't have to. His touch was the system itself. He understood early what others didn't. The real profit wasn't in selling liquor, but in organizing those who sold it. Within a year, he became the quiet coordinator behind half the bootlegging routes along Lake Erie. Detroit handled volume, Chicago handled muscle, Buffalo handled passage. To move across his river, you paid respect and tribute. No exceptions. Even the police learned the rhythm. A donation here, a favor there, a family funeral discreetly arranged. Soon no one stopped his trucks. At home, his wife Maria lit candles for the saints each night, praying for protection. She never asked where the money came from. The house grew warmer, the dinners richer, but Stefano's eyes remained the same, steady, distant, like a man always listening to something beyond the room. When their son, Peter, was born, Stefano held him in silence for a long moment. He imagined a future where the boy would inherit not wealth, but discipline. The silence that guarded everything he'd built. Buffalo itself was transforming. What had been a port city became a secret capital of indulgence. Behind barbershops, in warehouses, beneath church halls, bottles flowed as freely as ever, perhaps even more so. Politicians publicly condemned the devil's drink, while privately sending chauffeurs to collect cases from the riverfront. And every week, Stefano's cut of the proceeds arrived wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine, tucked beneath ledgers and invoices for coffins. He never carried a gun. He didn't need one. Men who raised their voices around him found themselves out of business, or out of breath. He once told a driver who'd gotten careless, "Noise is for men who want to be remembered. I prefer to be obeyed." The driver nodded. 2 weeks later, he disappeared on the Canadian side. No one mentioned him again. Through the early 1920s, the network thickened. He formed quiet understandings with Canadian distillers, who appreciated a customer that paid in gold and never asked for receipts. He struck arrangements with dock officials and customs clerks who suddenly found envelopes beneath their doorsteps. At every link of the chain, silence was the currency. And silence paid well. By 1924, Stefano was no longer merely an undertaker. He was a conductor orchestrating a symphony of unseen hands. Bootleggers, labor unions, corrupt officials, all moved in time to his unspoken rhythm. He preferred meetings in funeral parlors where talk stayed soft, respectful. The smell of lilies reminded men that life was fragile, and that Magaddino, by profession, knew exactly how fragile. He kept records by memory alone. No ledgers, no signatures. Only a rosary of numbers in his head, each bead representing another shipment, another favor. Someone owed him, he remembered. If someone betrayed him, he remembered longer. And yet, for all his order, he carried the weight of Sicily inside him. The code, the patience, the shadows of his youth. Some nights, when snow blanketed the city in perfect quiet, he would sit by the window with a glass of wine he didn't drink. He'd stare into the street, watching flakes swirl under the lamplight, and think of the sea, how it swallowed everything without sound. That was the model he followed. A sea of silence. Rumors began to spread beyond Buffalo. In Cleveland, in Chicago, even in New York City, men spoke of a Sicilian north of the river who never laughed, never boasted, and never lost. They called him Il Becchino, half out of respect, half out of superstition. The Undertaker who buried his enemies without funerals. He avoided alliances with the reckless. When the Dons of Detroit invited him to a grand banquet, he declined, citing family obligations. He knew too many loud men ended up in the newspapers. He preferred to let others draw attention while he drew lines. Every rival who underestimated him ended up paying tribute eventually, or vanishing quietly into the folds of the border. The Niagara itself became mythic. By day it was a tourist attraction, couples in overcoats watching mist rise from the falls. By night it was a smuggler's paradise. Speedboats roared unseen in the fog, their lanterns dimmed, pilots steering by memory. Men whispered that the river belonged to Magaddino. The truth was more subtle. The river belonged to no one, but it served those who respected its silence. And Stefano respected it as one respects confession. His most trusted men, small-time criminals, bar owners, longshoremen, worked not out of fear but devotion. He treated loyalty as inheritance. Those who kept faith were rewarded with stability, something rare in their world. A steady paycheck, a priest's blessing at their weddings, and the assurance that their families would be cared for if anything went wrong. He made crime feel like community. That was his genius. By 1926, his influence reached far beyond bootlegging. The laborers' union, Local 210, began to move under his quiet direction. Through construction contracts and dockyard labor, he gained control of manpower itself, the city's muscle. Every bridge, every warehouse, every tunnel dug along the riverfront passed through hands he could summon with a phone call. And yet he remained invisible. No headlines, no trials, no witnesses. Just the Undertaker with his immaculate black suit and his unshakable calm. There were moments of violence, of course, inevitable in that world. A shipment hijacked by outsiders. A policeman too honest for his own safety. But each problem dissolved without spectacle. Bodies appeared only when necessary and funerals were swift. Buffalo's homicide rate stayed lower than most cities its size. Peace has always had a price. The decade rolled forward. The jazz grew louder, the dresses shorter, the nation drunk on its own hypocrisy. In New York, Capone's name filled headlines. In Chicago, machine guns sang in alleys. But in Buffalo, the snow muffled everything. Magaddino's empire grew not through chaos but through control. He built quietly, brick by brick, favor by favor, until even distant families sought his counsel. He hosted few gatherings, but when he did, men traveled hundreds of miles to sit at his table and listen. One such night, late in 1928, a storm raged outside. Thunder rolled over the frozen lake as candles flickered inside the parlor. Around the table sat men from Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Toronto. They spoke of routes, prices, federal raids. Stefano said little, only nodding as others argued. When the room fell into tense silence, he finally spoke. The river gives to those who do not disturb it. No one replied, but everyone understood. From that night, the Niagara corridor became sacred ground, his domain unquestioned. When the meeting ended, he walked one of the guests to the door. The man, young and eager, asked him how he built such quiet power. Stefano paused, looked toward the snow, and answered, by knowing when not to speak. The man never forgot those words. Years later he would repeat them under FBI questioning, though by then the Undertaker's silence had already become legend. As the decade closed, the Undertaker's fortune grew beyond measure. He bought land discreetly, invested through intermediaries and gave generously to the church. Priests praised his devotion, politicians thanked his donations. He attended every funeral of note, always in the same black hat, always with the same unreadable expression. He moved through Buffalo like a ghost that everyone respected but no one dared follow. Prohibition had made kings and corpses in equal number. For Magaddino it made something rarer, a dynasty built on restraint. When others fell to greed or bullets he endured. Because he never confused silence with weakness. He understood that the loudest man in the room was often the weakest, and that real power whispered. And so, as the 1920s gave way to the 1930s, as America stumbled from celebration into depression, Stefano stood untouched. The factories closed but his coffers filled. The bars went dark but his cellars gleamed. And through it all, the river kept flowing, dark and steady, carrying with it barrels, secrets, and the breath of a city that slept under his quiet watch. For Magaddino this was the golden hour, the stillness before history noticed him. He had turned prohibition into communion, vice into vocation, and silence into empire. But like every empire, even one built on whispers, the echo would eventually find its way back. Next time we'll enter the shadowed halls of power, where labor meets loyalty, and the Undertaker becomes more than a smuggler. The river gave him riches. But the city gave him permanence. By the early 1930s, the air over Buffalo carried a different kind of chill. The parties of the Roaring Twenties had gone quiet. The stock market had crashed, banks had folded, and men now waited in breadlines where speakeasies once thrived. Yet one man's fortune had not fallen. Stefano Magaddino, the Undertaker, had weathered the storm untouched, because his business, unlike the others, was built on human need. People would always die. People would always work. And both he controlled. The liquor routes across Niagara still ran, though slower now, more discreet. The real treasure was labor. When others saw idle hands, Stefano saw an army waiting to be organized. He began quietly investing in Local 210, the laborers' union, a group of masons, dockhands and construction men who built the bones of the city. Through cousins and godsons, he placed his people in small offices, then in bigger ones until the union itself spoke with his cadence. He didn't shout orders. He simply nodded and things moved. To the outside world, he was still the somber Sicilian with a funeral home near the river. To the men who carried shovels, he was the man who could make work appear when no one else could. If a man needed a job, Stefano found one. If a foreman needed peace, he arranged it. If a contractor needed his materials unbothered by inspectors, the path cleared overnight. And in return the envelopes returned to him, steady, respectful, unmarked. The docks were his cathedral now. The clang of metal, the groan of cranes, the calls of longshoremen, all rose like a choir. Each man believed he worked for his family, but in truth, they all worked for the Undertaker's empire. He attended no meetings, yet his presence lingered in every handshake, every payroll ledger. Magaddino understood that in America power didn't come from owning things, it came from owning who built them. His genius lay in patience. Where other bosses ruled by fear, he ruled by inevitability. If a rival contractor underbid him, their trucks were mysteriously vandalized. If a politician hesitated to approve his projects, the man's campaign donations vanished like mist. Everything happened quietly. Buffalo stayed calm, its peace maintained by invisible hands. On Sunday mornings he walked with his family to Mass. Maria in her dark shawl, little Peter clutching his father's gloved hand. He sat in the same pew each week, third from the back, the same unbroken silence during prayer. To the priest he was a generous benefactor. To the congregation, a model of success and restraint. Only a few guessed that the same calm eyes that watched the altar also watched the city like a chessboard. At the funeral home, business flourished. Every family, regardless of neighborhood, seemed to find their way there when grief arrived. He treated every ceremony with solemn grace, whether it honored a laborer or a city official. The candles burned evenly. The lilies never wilted. And beneath that fragrance of death, deals were struck that shaped the living. One winter evening, a young man named Sam Pieri came seeking help. His father, a foreman, had been beaten by strikebreakers at a construction site. The police called it an accident. Sam wanted justice. Stefano listened without interrupting, his fingers steepled under his chin. When the boy finished, Magaddino said only, "Work will resume next week. You'll be paid for your father's days." Sam nodded, confused but grateful. 3 nights later, the strikebreakers left town. No one ever saw them again. From that day, Sam worked for the family, not because he was forced to, but because he'd witnessed what quiet mercy could do. By the mid-1930s, the silent empire had expanded beyond the borderlands. Union dues flowed like tributaries into his coffers. City contracts were whispered through his intermediaries. Even judges greeted him with the slow respect of men who understood where the balance of peace truly rested. When federal agents from Washington passed through, they saw nothing worth investigating. No gambling halls, no gunfire, no bodies in the street. Buffalo appeared almost dull. That was how he wanted it. Still, there were cracks in the marble. Younger men grew impatient with his restraint. They saw Al Capone's headlines, Lucky Luciano's legends, and wondered why their own Don avoided fame. But Stefano knew the spotlight was poison. He told them, noise draws heat. Heat melts steel. He'd survived Sicily, survived Prohibition, and he intended to survive the American century too. Discipline, he believed, outlived passion. Sometimes, late at night, he'd walk the empty halls of his funeral home, the marble cool beneath his feet. He'd pause by the chapel where candles flickered in rows, whispering to the faces in framed photographs. Men gone, debts paid, names forgotten. He didn't mourn them. He simply catalogued them like stones in a wall that held his empire upright. Outside, snow drifted over the city he owned without ever needing to claim. The depression deepened. Work was scarce, but Local 210 thrived. If the city needed a bridge repaired, the bids always found their way to companies under his influence. If a family needed food, the union distributed it under his name. He became not just feared but necessary. A quiet ruler in a city that mistook stillness for safety. In 1937, a federal commission summoned him to testify about labor corruption. He arrived in a plain black suit, hat in hand, eyes mild. When questioned, he answered softly in accented English about providing for families. He denied everything and admitted nothing. Reporters later described him as a courteous man who seemed puzzled by the attention. The newspapers forgot him within days. Exactly as planned. Back home, his men celebrated the victory, but Stefano merely returned to work. He knew every victory carried the seed of exposure. He reminded his captains, when they write your name, your time is already ending. His own name, he decided, would remain in whispers only. By decade's end, Buffalo had become a city built by ghosts, bridges, tunnels, warehouses, all erected by men who would never know whose shadow sheltered them. Stefano walked among them unseen, a quiet overseer of prosperity and fear intertwined. And though he never stood on a scaffold or lifted a beam, the city itself had become his monument. Sometimes at dawn, as the first freight train screamed through the frost, he'd stand on his porch and listen. He didn't hear noise. He heard proof that the machine he'd built still turned, slow and obedient. Every hammer strike, every paycheck, every shovel in the ground was another heartbeat of his empire. And yet, somewhere deep inside, he understood that empires, like rivers, do not stay calm forever. The water changes, the hands change, the faith of men changes. But for now, in that long gray decade between the wars, Buffalo belonged to the Undertaker. And in his stillness, the city slept peacefully, never realizing who kept the nightmares away. Next time, we'll see the Undertaker's power reach its silent peak, and the first tremors of the storm that would one day undo it. By the late 1930s, Buffalo had learned to breathe in rhythm with its quiet ruler. Trains ran on time, docks stayed orderly, and construction never stopped. To outsiders, the city seemed blessed with stability in an era of chaos. Factories still roared. Paychecks still came. The river still whispered. And behind it all, unseen, Stefano Magaddino watched it unfold with the calm detachment of a man who believed in fate, and in silence. America was changing again. The Depression had loosened its grip. War clouds gathered overseas. Men who once smuggled whiskey now smuggled steel, rubber, and oil. The Undertaker shifted with the times, quietly aligning his interests with the military contracts pouring into Buffalo's factories. He knew the rhythm of necessity. When nations prepared for war, no one questioned where the cement came from, or who controlled the unions pouring it. He had become more than a crime boss. He was now a custodian of order, a silent broker between government and the streets. City officials came to him not with fear but with requests. They needed labor peace, construction on schedule, shipments unbothered. Stefano granted their wishes with a nod, never raising his voice. He didn't want power that announced itself. He wanted power that was assumed. Local 210 became the skeleton of the empire. Every brick laid, every road paved, Every dock reinforced carried his signature, invisible but absolute. And yet, to the men on the ground, he remained only the old man, a ghostly benefactor they'd never met. They heard stories, how he could make a mayor win or lose with a single phone call, how even church fundraisers passed through his blessing before success. Some laughed. Others prayed. All obeyed. Stefano's philosophy was simple. To build an empire you must first build a routine. Every morning he rose before dawn, ate a modest breakfast of bread and espresso, and read the local paper without emotion. Every week he attended mass, knelt without expression, and left a folded envelope in the donation box. Every evening he walked the riverbank alone, letting the mist soak his hat, his coat, his thoughts. He believed discipline kept a man alive longer than luck. His home on Delaware Avenue was a fortress disguised as a residence, 2 stories of muted elegance. The garden was immaculate, the curtains always drawn. Inside, Maria kept everything spotless, her silence matching his. They had learned to communicate in looks, not words. To her, he was both husband and stranger. He returned each night precisely at the same hour, hung his coat in the same place, kissed her forehead with the same solemn tenderness. Routine was affection. Predictability was safety. But not everyone in the family shared his restraint. The younger men, nephews and sons of old associates, grew restless. They had known only the comfort of his empire, not the hunger that built it. They wanted expansion, gambling halls, nightclubs, headlines. To them, Buffalo was too small for the legend they imagined. They forgot that Stefano's legend was precisely its invisibility. One evening during a family gathering, a nephew named Nino suggested they modernize operations, open betting parlors by jukebox routes, court the new syndicates in New York. Stefano listened silently, slicing his food with deliberate calm. When the young man finished, he said only, "Noise feeds fame. Fame feeds graves." The table fell silent. The lesson hung in the air like incense. Still, ambition is a disease that silence cannot cure. The young ones continued their side ventures, discreetly, believing the old man wouldn't notice. He always noticed. He simply waited. Time, he believed, punished arrogance better than bullets. In 1940, as Europe plunged into war, the Undertaker's empire entered its maturity. Smuggling routes that once carried liquor now moved foreign goods, sometimes weapons, sometimes morphine, sometimes secrets. The Niagara corridor became a shadow highway linking Canada's resources to America's hunger. The same fog that hid whiskey barrels now hid crates stamped with military codes. Buffalo thrived while the world burned. Even the federal government turned a blind eye. Factories needed labor stability, and Local 210 provided it. No strikes, no slowdowns, no trouble. The city's war production became a model of efficiency, and officials congratulated themselves on their cooperative spirit. Only a few understood who made that cooperation possible. In private, Stefano reminded his men, "We serve the country by serving ourselves. But remember, the flag changes. The river stays." By 1945, the war ended and the soldiers came home. Buffalo swelled again, families, money, construction, noise. But beneath that post-war optimism, the old man sensed danger. Peace, he knew, bred impatience. Men who had risked their lives overseas now craved excitement. New rackets emerged: slot machines, narcotics, loan sharking. And with them came young blood, reckless, impatient, American-born. They didn't understand the old Sicilian code. They mistook patience for weakness. One night, at his home, a trusted lieutenant brought news. A small-time gambler had refused to pay tribute. The man bragged that the Undertaker was past his time. Stefano listened in silence, the ticking of the clock filling the space between words. After a long pause, he said, "Then let time remind him." Within a week, the gambler vanished. The police found nothing. The message was heard loud and clear across the city. The Undertaker might be aging, but time still obeyed him. His control now extended beyond Buffalo. Cleveland, Rochester, Erie, all deferred to his quiet rule. Meetings were rare, but when they occurred, they took place in homes rather than hotels, around dinner tables rather than desks. He believed formality invited observation. Hospitality concealed hierarchy. Those who sat with him remembered his eyes more than his words, gray, heavy, unreadable. When he finally spoke, it was always final. In 1951, his name surfaced in a federal inquiry into organized crime. Reporters described him as the most powerful Sicilian in upstate New York. He neither confirmed nor denied it. He gave no interviews, issued no statements. He simply went on with his routine: funerals, family dinners, river walks. When agents came to his door, he greeted them with the courtesy of a man welcoming unexpected guests. They left with nothing but polite frustration. That was the essence of his empire, intangibility. No papers, no recordings, no witnesses. Just a network of loyalties stitched together by fear, faith, and gratitude. In a world of noise, he remained an absence too large to touch. But even the quietest rulers cannot escape time. His son Peter was now a grown man, educated, proud, and American in spirit. He respected his father but not his shadow. He wanted a life without whispers, without the weight of invisible debts. Stefano understood, but he also knew the river never released what it once carried. He had built a life no one could leave untouched. When Peter asked to move away, to California perhaps, Stefano said nothing. He simply looked at him with eyes both proud and resigned. That night, Maria wept quietly, and Stefano walked alone by the river until dawn. The empire was at its height, yet loneliness had become its crown. He had conquered silence so completely that even love had no room to speak. In the reflection of the river, he sometimes saw his younger self, the boy from Castellamare, the one who had watched the sea crash against the cliffs and believed silence was safety. Now he wondered if silence was simply another kind of prison. Still he continued his rituals. Sunday Mass, Monday ledgers, Tuesday meetings, Thursday walks. The machine hummed on, perfect and obedient. But somewhere in the distance he sensed the first faint stirrings of change. New faces in law enforcement, new technologies, new kinds of listening. America was growing less private, more curious. The age of microphones and wiretaps had begun. And though he couldn't see them yet, the eyes of the FBI were beginning to turn north. For now though, the city still slept peacefully under his reign. The snow fell softly on the roofs, the factories glowed faintly through mist, and the Undertaker's shadow stretched long and unbroken across both sides of the river. He had done what few men ever managed, built an empire without spectacle, ruled without being seen, and endured without ever confessing ambition. The silent empire had risen, quiet as prayer, steady as the tide. But the higher the silence, the sharper the echo that follows. Next time we'll follow that echo. Into the corridors of family, envy, and betrayal. There comes a point in every empire where silence becomes its own burden. The quiet that once protected begins to isolate, and the faces that once smiled in loyalty start to look away when the ruler enters the room. For Stefano Magaddino, that moment arrived not with a bullet or betrayal from an enemy, but with the slow corrosion of family. The war was over and prosperity had returned. Buffalo's factories glowed again, its neighborhoods bustled with laughter, radios, and new cars lining the streets. But inside the mansion on Delaware Avenue, time had stopped. Maria moved through the halls like a ghost, her footsteps soft against the marble. The curtains stayed drawn, the clocks wound precisely, the meals served at the same hour each night. Routine had once been comfort, now it was confinement. Their son Peter had grown restless. He was handsome, articulate, and American in a way his father would never be. He loved the sound of jazz, the thrill of open roads, the freedom to speak without consequence. But he also loved his father, though that love came laced with unease. He admired Stefano's dignity, his iron composure, but he feared the silence that filled every space between them. Even at dinner, father and son spoke like diplomats rather than blood. Peter wanted legitimacy. He wanted to build something that didn't depend on envelopes or favors. But every opportunity seemed to arrive through his father's name. No one dealt with him directly, they deferred to the old man. And every kindness he received felt like another chain. One night, over coffee, he tried to tell his father this. Stefano listened, eyes lowered, stirring his cup once before replying. Everything we have, we earned in darkness. You cannot stand in the light without it showing on your face. Peter said nothing more. He left the house early the next morning and didn't return for days. Meanwhile, among Stefano's nephews and distant cousins, another kind of restlessness spread, one born of envy. The world was changing fast and younger men wanted their share. Names like Bonanno and Gambino filled newspapers. New York bosses were becoming celebrities, appearing in court with tailored suits and photographers flashing at every angle. They were being written about, feared, mythologized. To the new generation, silence looked old-fashioned. They confused stillness with irrelevance. Stefano watched them carefully. He could sense the tremor beneath their smiles, the impatience that comes when men forget what their peace costs. He knew better than to argue. He simply withdrew, letting their ambition ripen, letting time make its slow harvest. One of them, Nino, the same nephew who'd once challenged him at the dinner table, had begun diverting shipments, pocketing profits that belonged to the family. He met with outsiders in Cleveland, spoke freely about expanding into narcotics, something Stefano forbade. To him, heroin was chaos, too loud, too visible, too corrosive. He'd built a life controlling men who believed they were honest workers. Addiction destroyed that illusion. It made men desperate, unreliable, uncontrollable. He had no room for that poison. When word reached him that Nino was dealing with foreign suppliers, Stefano didn't react immediately. He went to Mass instead. He lit a candle for his ancestors, then another for the boy. Afterward, he told his consigliere, "Let the river take its course." A week later, Nino's car was found submerged near the Whirlpool Rapids. No one mentioned his name again. The silence returned, deeper than before. But silence is not the same as peace. The disappearance rippled through the family, an unspoken wound. Some grew more obedient, others more frightened. And fear, Stefano knew, was a fragile foundation. He could control men through respect, but fear only worked when he was present, and he was aging. At 60, his face had grown leaner, his hair white, his eyes the color of pewter. He still walked with composure, still wore his black suits pressed and spotless, but the energy of the 1920s had long faded. The city around him had changed too. The young no longer cared about omerta or honor. They cared about cars, money, music, and noise. Buffalo's underworld was fracturing into fragments, each one pulling away from the center he'd held for decades. The FBI, once blind to Cosa Nostra's reach, had begun paying attention. New agents arrived with fresh energy and new technology, recorders hidden in lamps, telephones tapped, informants paid by the week. In 1953, the Bureau opened a field office in Buffalo. They called their operation Silent Harbor. They didn't yet have evidence, but they had suspicion, and in America, suspicion was enough to start watching. One night, a neighbor told Stefano he'd seen men sitting in unmarked cars outside, pretending to read newspapers. Stefano smiled faintly. He wasn't angry, he was amused. For 40 years, he had built his life so carefully that no piece of paper, no photograph, no confession could tie him to anything. What could they possibly record? A man walking by the river, an old immigrant attending church, a funeral director offering condolences? The thought almost made him laugh. Almost. Still, he tightened his circle. He cut off distant relatives who drew attention, forbade meetings in public places, reduced phone calls to single sentences. He returned to the habits of Sicily, coded phrases, silent gestures, conversations disguised as prayers. But in doing so, he found himself growing lonelier than ever before. Maria passed away quietly one autumn morning. She'd been ill for months, though he'd refused to accept it. At her funeral, the church overflowed with mourners, union leaders, priests, city officials, neighbors. Stefano stood at the front, eyes dry, face carved in stone. When the service ended, he lingered in the pews long after everyone left. The candles flickered low, and he realized that for the first time in his life, the silence he had worshipped now felt hollow. It no longer protected him, it swallowed him. After her death, Peter returned home for a time. Father and son spoke more in those weeks than they had in years, though neither ever said what truly mattered. Peter wanted him to retire, to leave the business behind. "You could live anywhere," he said. "You've earned peace." Stefano smiled faintly. "I already live in peace," he answered. But his tone betrayed fatigue more than conviction. As 1955 approached, the empire began to show its age. Rival families moved into new markets. Younger captains sought autonomy. The once sacred unity of the Buffalo organization began to splinter. Some whispered that Stefano had lost his edge. Others still feared him, but from distance. A kingdom of whispers was becoming a kingdom of echoes. One night, he sat by the fireplace, the radio humming faint jazz. Peter had gone out, the house was quiet, and the snow outside glowed under the street lamps. He thought of all he had built, bridges, unions, generations of men who would never know his name. He thought of Sicily, of the cousin who died by the sea, of his first crossing to America. Everything seemed both distant and immediate, like looking through fog at his own reflection. He wondered whether all rulers eventually became prisoners of their own calm. In those days, local rumor told of tunnels under Niagara Falls, narrow corridors used to smuggle liquor during Prohibition, now long abandoned. Teenagers dared each other to explore them. No one ever found evidence they existed. But the myth persisted, as myths always do. Some said Stefano had built them. Others said he buried something down there, gold, ledgers, bodies, truth. He never confirmed nor denied. He simply smiled when asked and said, "The river keeps its secrets." That was the last time Buffalo would see him smile. Within a year, the federal gaze would turn sharper. Agents would dig, reporters would pry, and the silent empire would tremble for the first time. The era of quiet control was fading. The next would bring spotlights, cameras, and a name whispered across America: Apalachin. But for now, the city still slept. The river still hummed. And inside his house, the old Undertaker sat in his chair, staring at the last ember dying in the hearth. His glow faint, steady, and fading. Just like him. Next time the silence breaks. A countryside meeting. Dozens of black cars. And a raid that changed everything. It began as most storms do, with a calm morning. November 14, 1957. Upstate New York wore its late autumn silence like a shroud. Frost glazed the fields, the trees stood bare, and smoke curled gently from farmhouse chimneys. To any passerby, the little hamlet of Apalachin looked utterly ordinary. Just barns, gravel roads, and a single white house sitting quietly at the end of McFall Road. But the house was not ordinary. It belonged to Joseph Barbara, a local bottling plant owner with friends no one quite understood. By mid-morning, cars began to arrive: Cadillacs, Lincolns, Chryslers, all spotless, all black or gray, all carrying men in dark suits. They parked neatly across the lawn, boots crunching on frozen grass, voices low, movements precise. Neighbors peeked through curtains and whispered, "What kind of family gathering looked like that?" In one of those cars, silent and motionless, sat Stefano Magaddino. He had risen before dawn, dressed as always in black, polished his shoes, tied his scarf twice against the cold. His driver had asked if it was worth the risk. So many eyes, so much attention. Stefano's answer was simple. When the commission calls, you attend. Silence is not absence. He'd built his life on that principle. He would not abandon it now. The road to Apalachin wound through fog and bare trees. To him, it felt almost like Sicily again. Those quiet hills where men met to decide the fate of empires under the guise of family dinners. Today's meeting was meant to be the same. A private council, a barbecue of peace among the nation's most powerful dons. Luciano's men, Genovese's men, Gambinos, Prophesies, Trafficants, Bananos. And from Buffalo, the Undertaker himself. 40 bosses, one table. The purpose, whispered weeks earlier, was to settle disputes after the assassination of Albert Anastasia in New York. The underworld needed calm. Business needed continuity. And Magaddino, the oldest among them, was there as the voice of caution. To remind the younger dons that survival still required silence. When he stepped out of the car, the cold bit deep, the air smelling faintly of wood smoke and gasoline. He greeted a few old faces with quiet nods. They smiled at him with the respect reserved for a patriarch. Inside, servants hurried with trays of food: steaks, sausages, coffee, red wine hidden in soda bottles. Laughter rose from the kitchen, heavy and nervous. It should have been just another meeting. It should have passed unseen like all the others before it. But fate, as ever, favored the curious. A state trooper named Ed Croswell was patrolling nearby when he noticed the sudden traffic. Dozens of luxury cars on a dead-end country road. Too many plates from too many cities. New York, Chicago, Cleveland, Buffalo, Detroit. Something didn't fit. He turned his cruiser onto the dirt lane, his curiosity sharpening with each tire mark. Inside the house, word spread quickly. "Police," someone whispered. "Not federal agents, not a raid, just a trooper." But panic is contagious. The younger men, and used to calm under pressure, sprang to their feet. Some bolted for the doors. Others fled through the kitchen, spilling coffee and curses. One ran into the woods in polished shoes. Another dove behind the garage. Stefano remained seated for a moment, eyes closed, listening to the chaos unfold like a distant storm. He could hear the sound of engines starting, gravel scattering, doors slamming. He opened his eyes, exhaled, and stood slowly. "So," he murmured, "the river finally breaks its ice." He walked to the window. Beyond the frost-blurred glass, he saw men running into the trees, their dark coats flapping like startled crows. A few cars skidded into ditches. In the yard, a trooper's hat glinted in the pale light. The silence of the countryside was shattered by the hum of panic. And with it, 40 years of invisibility began to dissolve. By afternoon, the property was surrounded. State police had radioed for backup, and soon the air buzzed with sirens. Roadblocks went up along the highway. Neighbors watched from porches as suited men stumbled from the woods, mud on their shoes, breath puffing white. Some pretended to be salesmen, others claimed to be guests lost on their way to a wedding. But no one believed them. Cameras arrived next. Flashbulbs exploded in the gray air, freezing faces that had spent lifetimes avoiding light. The images would soon appear in newspapers across America. The day the Mafia was proven real. For decades the FBI had called it myth. Now their denials turned to dust under the glare of a rural police camera. When agents asked for his name, Stefano gave it calmly. Magaddino. Stefano. Buffalo. He smiled faintly. His hands trembled not from fear but from cold. He carried no weapon, no document, nothing that could betray him. He had lived too long to leave traces now. Still, they photographed him, an old man with gray hair, heavy eyes, and the faintest curve of a smirk. To reporters he looked like a grandfather dragged from Sunday Mass. To those who knew, that picture captured the quiet fall of a dynasty. After hours of questioning, the police released most of the men for lack of evidence. They had broken no laws simply by gathering. Yet the damage was done. In the eyes of the public, Cosa Nostra was no longer a rumor whispered in Italian backrooms, it was flesh, faces and headlines. And in the eyes of the FBI, Stefano's name, once a whisper, was now an entry on a file. Back in Buffalo the mood turned uneasy. His men whispered of wiretaps, of informants, of lists. Some urged him to flee the country, others blamed Barber for incompetence. Stefano said nothing. He simply returned to his office above the funeral home, drew the blinds and lit a cigarette he didn't smoke. He stared at the river in silence for a long time. The water looked different now, still but no longer safe. In the weeks that followed, federal agents raided homes, subpoenaed witnesses, froze accounts. Reporters called daily, circling like gulls over a carcass. Every story used the same phrase, the Silent Empire. A name that once described his power now described his exposure. It was almost poetic. He'd ruled by silence, and silence, finally, had betrayed him. He didn't rant, didn't panic. He adjusted as always. He cut expenses, ended certain operations, redirected funds through new channels. He told his lieutenants to go back to work, to keep their heads down. Let the noise tire itself, he said. It always does. But he knew the echo of Apalachin would not fade quickly. The Bureau was learning. Every conversation was now a risk, every loyal man a potential witness. The code of Omerta, once sacred, was fraying in the age of microphones and plea bargains. One evening Peter visited him, holding a newspaper with his father's photograph on the front page. The headline read, Mafia Summit Raided in Rural New York. He laid it on the table without a word. Stefano looked at it for a long time, then pushed it aside. You see, he said softly. When men stop fearing God, they start fearing headlines. Peter stared at him, unsure whether it was pride or despair he heard in that voice. Perhaps both. In the months that followed, indictments came and went. Trials fizzled. Most charges couldn't stick. But reputation, once quiet, never returned to silence. Every knock at the door made Maria's old maids jump. Every phone ring carried suspicion. Even the parish priests grew cautious when they saw him approach the confessional. He remained courteous, devout, unchanged, but Buffalo no longer looked at him the same way. For the first time the Undertaker knew what it was to be seen. And he hated it. He still attended funerals, still signed condolences, still walked the river path at dusk. But the calm had changed. He could feel eyes behind curtains, hear the faint clicks of distant cameras. The world had grown louder and he could not silence it. Sometimes, standing by the water, he thought of Sicily again. The boy he'd been, the sea that had taught him patience. He wondered if the island had known this kind of exposure, if even the sea could be stripped of mystery. He whispered to the river, they can see the surface but not the depth. And for the first time he wasn't sure he believed it. Apalachin marked more than a raid, it marked a transformation. The Mafia was no longer invisible. The era of whispers was ending, replaced by courtrooms, recordings, and bright, merciless light. Stefano had spent a lifetime perfecting stillness, yet the world had turned restless around him. Still he did not fall. Not yet. He endured because endurance was the only prayer he had left. But he understood something that night, something even he could not escape. When silence becomes famous, it stops being silence. The empire still stood, but its walls had begun to echo. Next time we return to Buffalo in the long, uneasy aftermath, where paranoia replaces loyalty, and silence begins to turn inward. The snow fell differently after Apalachin. It no longer soothed the city, it blanketed it, heavy and watchful, as if the sky itself were taking notes. Buffalo's streets glistened under street lamps, every drifting flake reflecting a faint, cold light. And in that light, the Undertaker's empire no longer looked invisible. It looked exposed. Stefano Magaddino sat by his office window one evening, staring at the dark river that had once been his ally. For 40 years, it had carried his secrets without a sound. Now even the river seemed to whisper. He could hear its current under the ice, slow and tired, like the breath of something old remembering too much. He had outlasted wars, presidents, and rival dons, but he could not outlast curiosity. America had found a new addiction, the truth. In the months after the Apalachin raid, newspapers called him the Undertaker of Niagara. Some described him as dignified, others as sinister. Reporters knocked at his door daily, their breath turning white in the cold. He ignored them all. He went to church. He went to work. He buried the dead. He did what he had always done. But silence, once sacred, now sounded suspicious. Every quiet gesture looked like concealment. Every calm word like deceit. The FBI opened a formal case file on him that winter. Agents mapped his properties, traced his phone lines, questioned anyone who had ever worked near him. They called it Operation Undertow. They believed he ran a multi-state network of rackets, narcotics, and labor corruption. They were right, just decades too late. But they wanted evidence, and evidence had never been part of his design. Inside the family, fear began to erode loyalty. Men who once toasted to his name now avoided his gaze. Some had wives who whispered about subpoenas. Others had sons who feared prison more than dishonor. One by one the cracks widened. Wiretaps recorded whispers of betrayal, half-phrases caught between static and guilt. For the first time, the Buffalo organization, long considered the most disciplined in America, began to fracture. Stefano felt it before he saw it. He'd always been sensitive to the rhythm of things, the way silence shifted when men stopped believing. Meetings grew shorter, eyes wandered, hands trembled when passing envelopes. He didn't shout or threaten. He simply withdrew. He believed distance could restore order. But distance only deepened suspicion. His son Peter visited often now, driving up from Rochester with his family. The grandchildren filled the mansion with brief bursts of laughter that reminded Stefano of a world he no longer understood. They spoke English quickly, brightly, without accents. Their joy was pure, untouched by fear. Sometimes he'd watch them play in the snow and think of the boy he once was on the Sicilian coast, before silence became survival. Now he realized he had nothing left to teach them. His wisdom belonged to another century. The Bureau's attention intensified. Agents followed him to church, to the funeral home, even to the grocery store. He learned to feel their presence without looking. He could sense it in the weight of air, in the slow movement of parked cars that lingered too long. He called them my angels, half in jest, half in fatigue. When a priest once asked if he feared arrest, Stefano replied, "Arrest is a form of respect. It means they finally learned to see." But he did fear something. Not prison but erosion. The slow undoing of everything he'd built, not through violence but through boredom. The young wanted noise, action, profit. They no longer believed in the sacred calm that had once defined his rule. To them his caution looked like weakness. His silence looked like old age. Among those young men was Peter Magaddino Jr., his nephew and namesake of his son. Bright, ambitious, reckless. He'd grown up under the shelter of Stefano's name, then began carving his own path. Running gambling rings, dabbling in narcotics, courting attention in a way the old man despised. He carried the family blood but not its restraint. To him the FBI's eyes were a challenge, not a warning. When Stefano confronted him, the boy laughed. "Times have changed, Zio," he said. "You can't run an empire like a monastery anymore." The words hung like smoke. Stefano said nothing, only stared until the laughter stopped. 2 months later, federal agents raided the nephew's home and seized nearly $500,000 in cash. The newspapers called it the Magaddino money vault. To the old man it was worse than any conviction. It was humiliation. The photographs showed young Peter's face above the caption, "Mafia fortune seized." For the first time, the Magaddino name stood in print not as legend, but as liability. He'd spent a lifetime avoiding attention, and now his own blood had dragged it to his doorstep. At the funeral home, he tore the newspaper in half and burned it in the sink. The ashes swirled up like gray snow. He watched them vanish into the air and whispered to himself, "You can bury men, not shame." The FBI seized more properties in the months that followed. They raided safe houses, intercepted trucks, froze accounts. Yet they still couldn't touch him directly. He'd built too many layers, too many fronts. He had no ledgers, no signatures, no witnesses willing to speak. But he could feel the walls tightening. Power, he realized, wasn't lost in a single day. It leaked slowly like heat from an old house. By 1962, the silent empire was no longer silent. It was tired. Each week brought another subpoena, another rumor, another betrayal disguised as friendship. His captains fought over territory, his lieutenants over money, his relatives over legacy. The organization that had once moved with the precision of a clock now ticked out of sync. One evening, while walking the river path, he stopped midway and leaned on the railing. The current below glowed faintly in the moonlight, fragments of ice drifting past. He thought of all the men who had crossed this water for him, drivers, smugglers, believers. Most were gone now, buried or forgotten. He wondered if they ever imagined how it would end, not with sirens but with paperwork, not with blood but with bureaucracy. It was a strange kind of death, slow and polite. A few days later, Peter came to visit again. He brought wine, though Stefano rarely drank any more. They sat by the fire in silence. Eventually the son said, "They'll never leave you alone now." "I know," Stefano replied. "Then why not stop?" "Because they haven't asked me to confess. They've asked me to disappear." He looked into the flames, his voice low and steady. "I built this city without noise. I will not let them bury me with noise." Outside, the wind pressed against the windows. It sounded almost like the sea. The following spring, federal investigators leaked details of a new initiative, the Organized Crime Strike Force. Buffalo was listed among its targets. Magaddino's empire was officially named a criminal syndicate of national importance. For a man who'd spent his life avoiding definitions, the irony was almost elegant. But he didn't fight back. He simply began retreating from public view. He stopped attending large gatherings, avoided phone calls, canceled travel. He became once again what he had always been, a ghost. His world shrank to the size of his home, his church, and the river. And yet, through all the decline, one truth endured: no one dared move against him directly. Even weakened, he commanded a quiet reverence. Men who cursed his name still crossed themselves before speaking it aloud. He had become less a leader and more a legend, a relic of the old world lingering stubbornly in the new. By the mid-1960s, the FBI estimated his fortune at over $10 million. He lived modestly, almost monastically. He still dressed in black, still rose before dawn, still walked the same path along the water. He would nod politely to strangers who had no idea who he was, and they would nod back, never realizing they'd greeted the ghost of a kingdom. And so the years passed, quiet but heavy. His empire, once the river's reflection, now resembled its current, broken into smaller streams, scattered and cold. The young men fought for scraps of his legend while the old ones vanished into prison or the grave. Stefano outlived them all, but even victory had grown lonely. Sometimes late at night, he'd hear the faint rumble of a freight train crossing the bridge and imagine it carrying the last of his silence away. He'd close his eyes and whisper, "The river forgets nothing." Then he'd fall asleep in his chair, the faint glow of the fireplace dancing across his still, patient face. Next time we follow the whispers beneath Niagara. Into legend, tunnels, and memory. The river has always carried two kinds of truth. The one that can be measured and the one that must be whispered. By the late 1960s, Stefano Magaddino had become both. To law enforcement he was a file number, a relic of Cosa Nostra, a man too old to chase and too cautious to convict. To Buffalo he was something else entirely, a rumor with a pulse, a name that still made old men lower their voices in diners. And to the people who lived near the water, he was a ghost said to have built tunnels beneath Niagara Falls. They said the tunnels were carved during Prohibition, linking Canadian cellars to American warehouses. That whiskey ran like a secret river through stone. That even now, after his empire had faded, the tunnels remained, abandoned, wet, humming faintly at night. No one had ever found them. But no one had ever stopped looking. Stefano never denied the stories. When reporters asked, he'd smile gently and say, "The river hides more than it shows." It wasn't an answer, it was an invitation to keep wondering. He understood myth. He'd spent a lifetime perfecting it. Those who still worked for him, what few remained, spoke of odd errands in his final years. Of crates moved at night to undisclosed basements. Of sealed vaults beneath funeral parlors. Of engineers quietly paid to pour concrete where no construction permit existed. It was said that in those tunnels, gold from decades of tribute lay untouched, guarded by the same silence that had built it. Others claimed it was something simpler, a safe passageway, a refuge, a way out if the world above ever turned too bright. No one knew. And that was exactly how the old man wanted it. In truth, by then he rarely left his home. His health had begun to fail, though he never admitted it. Each morning he still dressed in black, combed his hair neatly, polished his shoes. He sat by the window overlooking the river, the same river he'd once ruled like a silent kingdom. From there he could watch the water move, slow and constant, like time itself refusing to stop for him. He'd trace its motion with his eyes, remembering where the old routes had run, the crossings, the ice drifts, the barrels that had once carried fortunes. It was all gone now, absorbed into legend. But legend, he knew, was another kind of life. Buffalo had changed. Factories that once thundered under his control now stood hollow, windows broken, machines silent. The docks where his men had gathered were empty but for pigeons and rust. Even the funeral home had grown quiet. Fewer clients, fewer deals, fewer secrets. The city he'd built through whispers had learned to shout again. Television, newspapers, and new money filled the streets. His era, an era of patience and coded loyalty, was being replaced by noise. He watched it all unfold with neither bitterness nor nostalgia. It was simply the way of things. The river flows forward. Men do not. Sometimes, when insomnia gripped him, he'd ask his driver to take him to the falls. They would park near the overlook long after midnight when the tourists were gone. The mist rose thick from the gorge, shimmering in moonlight. The sound, immense, endless, filled the air like breathing. He'd step out slowly, cane in hand, the cold wrapping him like a cloak. He'd stand there for minutes, sometimes hours, saying nothing. The driver never asked what he was thinking. He didn't need to. The falls were the only confessional Stefano Magaddino had left. Some nights he'd imagine voices in the roar. Familiar names, long gone. Pietro from Sicily, Nino the nephew, Maria's gentle prayers. They seemed to drift in the mist, mixing with the spray and the wind. It didn't frighten him. It comforted him. Every man eventually becomes the sum of his echoes. These were his. The stories about the tunnels spread faster after that. Teenagers claimed they'd found entrances behind warehouses or under bridges. Police dismissed them, though sometimes, late at night, patrol officers heard metallic clangs from beneath the ground, too rhythmic for the river alone. A few workers repairing a culvert near Whirlpool Street reported hitting a sealed passage lined with bricks older than the city itself. It was immediately filled in. No report was filed. Some things, even in the age of evidence, remained unrecorded. When federal agents renewed their investigation in 1968, they found little more than dust. Magaddino's fortune, whatever remained, was scattered across properties and names that led nowhere. The banks held nothing but enough to suggest modest comfort. The empire, once vast, had dissolved into air. He had done what few men managed, buried his wealth so deep that even history couldn't exhume it. And in doing so, he'd buried himself. In his final years, he spoke often to priests, less as a penitent than as a philosopher. He asked once, "If a man keeps peace through fear, is he wicked or wise?" The priest replied, "That depends on whether he feared himself." Stefano smiled, bowed his head, and changed the subject. He never asked again. The last photograph taken of him shows an old man sitting by the river in a heavy coat, hands folded over a cane, eyes lowered as if listening to something beneath the water. Behind him, the mist curls upward like incense from a hidden altar. He looks small, but the stillness around him is immense. The caption simply reads, Magaddino, 1972, the Undertaker of Buffalo. That winter he stopped attending Mass. Neighbors saw fewer lights on at night. Only the occasional car would pull into his driveway, a doctor, a nephew, a loyal driver. Sometimes he'd open the window just enough to let the sound of the river drift in. The air smelled of ice and rust and memory. He would close his eyes and murmur in Sicilian, "The water remembers even when we forget." On the morning of July 19, 1974, Stefano Magaddino died quietly in his sleep. No violence, no witnesses, no confession. Just stillness. The newspapers wrote brief obituaries, Buffalo mob boss dead at 82. No funeral spectacle, no procession. Only a private mass attended by family, a few old associates, and a handful of priests who had long ago stopped asking questions. After his death, rumors bloomed like wildflowers. Some said his fortune was hidden under the falls. Others swore he'd built tunnels connecting every major building he ever owned. One man claimed to have found a map drawn in invisible ink, showing an underground labyrinth stretching from Niagara Falls to the Canadian border. Each story contradicted the next, yet all shared one truth: no one could find the end. Decades later, when new construction began near the river, workers broke through a section of stone wall beneath an abandoned warehouse. Behind it lay a narrow corridor, half collapsed, its floor wet with dripping water. They found old barrels, rotted planks, and a rusted lantern still hanging from a hook. There were no markings, no proof it belonged to Magaddino, but those who entered swore they felt a sudden cold, as though the air itself recognized trespass. The site was sealed again within a week. Whether the tunnels were real or imagined no longer mattered. They had become part of the river's story. A hidden pulse beneath the roar, a secret humming under the mist. And perhaps that was the point. For Stefano Magaddino, legend was the last form of silence. A myth could never be cross-examined. A story could never be subpoenaed. Tonight, if you stand by the Niagara Falls after midnight and listen long enough, you might hear something beneath the thunder. Not voices, not machinery, but a slow rhythm, deep and patient. Like footsteps echoing through stone. Like barrels rolling across damp ground. Or perhaps just the Undertaker himself, walking his hidden corridors in peace, still guarding what the river chose to keep. Next time we return to the surface. To a family divided, a fortune lost, and a legacy fading into twilight. When the river lost its keeper, Buffalo lost its silence. The death of Stefano, the Undertaker, Magaddino did not end an empire in a storm of bullets or sirens. It ended like the final note of a hymn, soft, fading, and unresolved. But for those he left behind, that silence became something else. It became a wound. The year was 1974, and America had changed beyond recognition. The Mafia, once whispered about, was now televised. Senate hearings, Hollywood films, books with bold titles, The Godfather, The Commission Inside the Mafia, had turned crime into spectacle. For a public that once denied its existence, the mob had become myth, and myth had become entertainment. But behind the fiction, real families fought for what little power remained. Buffalo's was no exception. After Stefano's death, leadership passed not through ceremony but by inertia. The family was fractured, half clinging to the old ways, half chasing the new. The old guard wanted quiet control. Unions, construction, politics. The young men wanted flash, casinos, narcotics, fast money. They called it modernization. The elders called it suicide. At the center of it all was Peter Magaddino, Stefano's son, the last legitimate heir to the old man's authority. He had never wanted the throne, but blood had a way of binding tighter than intention. In the months after the funeral, he tried to keep the peace, meeting with lieutenants, smoothing rivalries, reassuring nervous allies. But the name Magaddino no longer inspired obedience. To some, it inspired opportunity. To others, revenge. The first cracks appeared in whispers. Rumors that Peter lacked the iron will of his father. That he preferred business to discipline, civility to fear. He met these rumors with quiet dignity, hoping reason could rebuild what fear once held together. But reason had no currency in a world raised on silence and debt. Without the old man's presence, the gravity that kept every man in orbit around him was gone. And when gravity disappears, things drift apart. FBI agents who had watched Stefano for decades, now turned their attention to his successors. They were younger, less careful, easier to provoke. Wiretaps caught petty arguments, jealousy, men bragging on phones their uncles would never have trusted. The Bureau didn't need to break the code anymore. The new generation broke it for them, one careless word at a time. By 1978, indictments hit like winter storms. Union officials tied to Local 210 were charged with extortion. Bookmakers flipped under pressure. One by one, the pillars of the silent empire were dragged into light. Each raid, each arrest, each headline erased another piece of the illusion that Buffalo was still under control. In truth, it hadn't been for years. Peter tried to steer what remained toward legitimacy, investments in real estate, trucking, small businesses. But his cousins resented the restraint. They wanted the river's ghosts revived. The shipments, the tunnels, the old methods. They didn't see that the world had changed. They didn't understand that the old river now flowed under surveillance. Meetings grew tense. Conversations once coded in glances now ended in shouting. One night, at a restaurant near Niagara Falls, two branches of the family met to settle accounts. Voices rose, fists clenched, accusations flew. "You're killing what he built," one elder said. "And you already buried it," the younger replied. The argument ended with shattered glass and a police report that made the morning papers. For the first time in 60 years, the name Magaddino appeared beside the word brawl. It was more than humiliation. It was prophecy. The FBI, sensing blood in the water, doubled its presence. Agents recorded conversations in bars, wired union halls, turned relatives into informants. They didn't need to catch the family committing crimes, they just had to wait until the family destroyed itself. And slowly, inevitably, it did. Old loyalties curdled into lawsuits, accusations, paranoia. Property titles were disputed, bank accounts frozen. The fortune Stefano had buried in secrecy now reappeared in fragments. Safe deposit boxes, hidden ledgers, envelopes of cash discovered behind false walls. Each discovery became another headline, another wound. The empire, once built on invisibility, was being excavated in public. In those years, the Undertaker's legend grew even as his family collapsed. Reporters wrote profiles calling him the last old world Don. Books painted him as a philosopher of silence, a relic of discipline in a noisy century. But for his descendants, that myth felt less like honor and more like shadow. They couldn't live up to it. They couldn't escape it. The world no longer feared the name Magaddino, it pitted it. Peter aged quietly like his father, but without his father's reverence. He spent his final years managing what remained of the funeral business, attending small community events, speaking softly when asked about the past. He never denied who his father had been. He simply said, he believed order kept the world from falling apart. And then after a pause, but order costs more than anyone can pay. He died in 1998, long after the family's power had evaporated, long after Buffalo's skyline had changed and the river's edge had turned into a park. At his funeral, fewer than 50 people attended. There were no headlines, no protests, no fear. Just a handful of mourners and a priest who recited Psalm 46. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea. Outside, the Niagara flowed as it always had, cold, relentless, indifferent. The surviving relatives scattered across the country, changing their names, opening small businesses, trying to outrun the past. Some succeeded, some didn't. But in Buffalo the legend remained. Taxi drivers still told stories to tourists about the tunnels. Old barbers swore they'd once cut the Undertaker's hair. A few locals claimed to have seen his ghost walking near the river on foggy nights. An old man in a black coat, hands folded behind his back, staring into the mist as if expecting someone to answer. The family that once ruled two nations had become folklore. But folklore, unlike power, endures. Every empire dies differently. Rome crumbled under invasion. Carthage burned. But the silent empire didn't fall in flames or blood. It dissolved in conversation. In gossip, betrayal, memory. It died the way its founder had lived, quietly. And in that strange symmetry, there was something almost peaceful. Sometimes, on calm evenings when the river reflects the city lights, it's easy to imagine the Undertaker still there, watching, patient, unseen. The water hums its eternal song, and the ghosts of his family drift with it, not as kings or criminals, but as echoes in the current. Because silence, like the river, never truly ends. It only changes direction. Next time the twilight deepens. The city moves on and the old empire becomes memory itself. The river freezes first along the edges. A thin white crust that spreads, slow and inevitable, until even the current beneath moves like breath under ice. In Buffalo, winter does not arrive, it settles. It seeps into the bones of the city, into the bricks, into the silence left behind by those who once ruled it. And for decades after the Undertaker's death, that silence remained. By the late 1980s, the Niagara corridor had become something unrecognizable. Factories that once throbbed with life stood gutted. The docks were empty except for gulls and wind. You could walk for blocks without hearing anything but the echo of your own footsteps on wet pavement. People said the city was haunted, but not by ghosts, by memory. By the weight of things left unsaid. Every so often, the past surfaced like something thawing out of the river ice. An old news article, a forgotten photograph, a retired detective recalling the days when Buffalo mattered. Always the name returned, Magaddino. Whispered, never shouted. A name not quite buried, not quite alive. The silent empire had outlived its ruler, but only as rumor, suspended in the cold air of recollection. For those who had served the old man, the years were cruel. One by one they vanished, some to prison, some to nursing homes, some to the slow erosion of age. A few still met quietly at cafes on Niagara Street, sharing coffee and stories like relics, trading ghosts. They would talk about how calm he had been, how little he'd said, how much he'd known. And then one would sigh and murmur, the old ways died with him. Outside, snow would drift past the windows and the conversation would fade. The younger generation, the grandchildren, the great-nephews, grew up without the weight of secrecy. They lived ordinary lives. Accountants, teachers, small business owners. They no longer carried envelopes or whispered blessings before deals. They had no need for code words or confessions. But in certain houses, late at night, when the wind howled off Lake Erie, someone would still light a candle near a photograph of a man in a black hat. The faint inscription beneath reading simply, Illinois Becchino. No one explained the name to the children. They just said, he kept the peace when peace was hard to keep. For the city, the legend became comfort. A piece of folklore to tell tourists on dark evenings. How the Undertaker of Buffalo once ran an empire so silent it outlasted every scream. Guides would point toward the mist and say, somewhere beneath all that water, his tunnels still sleep. It didn't matter if it was true. Stories like rivers don't need proof to keep flowing. The FBI files, once thick and red-stamped, began to yellow with dust. Agents who had once dreamed of catching Magaddino retired or died. Their successors treated the case as history, a curiosity from another era. They found recordings with nothing but static photographs labeled, subject unknown. The Bureau's conclusion, decades later, was quietly filed away. Insufficient evidence. Subject deceased. That was how the silent empire officially ended, not with trial or confession, but with paperwork and indifference. And yet, even as time moved forward, the river remained unchanged. Every winter, it froze at the edges. Every spring, it broke free. The same way it had done when Stefano first arrived from Sicily, and the same way it will long after every name has faded. The river remembers nothing, and everything. There is a bar still standing near Niagara Street, old enough to have served whiskey during the Prohibition years. The wooden counter is worn smooth, the ceiling low. Behind it hangs a framed black and white photograph of a funeral procession. A row of men in dark coats walking behind a horse-drawn hearse through falling snow. The owner tells customers, that was his last ride. No one asks whose. They all know. They just sip their drinks quietly, as if toasting someone who never asked for a toast. In the stillness of Buffalo's long winters, it's easy to imagine the Undertaker still out there. Not as a man, but as a presence woven into the fog, the alleys, the rhythm of the river. A whisper beneath the wind, a shape glimpsed in passing headlights. The echo of shoes on frozen pavement that stops the moment you turn to listen. He outlived almost everyone who ever crossed him, and even those who cursed his name learned to speak it softly. He became what all-powerful men eventually become, myth. And myth, in its own way, is another kind of immortality. Once, a priest who had known him in his final years was asked if the old man had ever repented. The priest smiled faintly and said, he never confessed his sins. He confessed his silence. Then, as if realizing he'd said too much, he crossed himself and added, but perhaps that was enough. Outside that same church, decades later, the bell still rings every evening at 6. Its sound carries down the hill, across the empty lots, toward the river. Sometimes when the air is clear it echoes twice. Once from the church and once from somewhere unseen, as though the river itself is answering. That is how the legend endures. Not in books or headlines but in echoes. Buffalo, for all its gray winters and broken roofs, still sleeps easier under that echo. It reminds the city that even power once wrapped in darkness can fade into peace. That every silence, no matter how heavy, eventually turns into rest. And when the first snow falls each year, dusting the bridges and the banks of the Niagara, somewhere in some quiet house an old radio hums a low jazz tune, and someone says softly, to the Undertaker. A name that once commanded fear now brings only stillness. Outside, the river flows beneath its new ice. The same river. The same sound. A long, slow exhale across decades of noise. The long winter never truly ends here. It simply learns to breathe. Next time we bring the river's story full circle. From myth to memory, from silence to sleep. Night falls early over the Niagara. The river darkens before the city lights even wake. In that thin hour between dusk and night, Buffalo feels older than it is. Older than its factories, older than its bridges, older even than the stories whispered in its bars. Feels like a memory that refuses to fade. And if you listen closely, beneath the wind and the hum of the current, you can almost hear it breathing. They say every city remembers its ghosts differently. New York buries them in noise, Chicago drowns them in neon. But Buffalo remembers them in silence. The kind that lingers after snow falls, or after a church bell stops ringing. The kind that waits for you to lean closer before it speaks. Somewhere near the river an old house still stands. Its paint has peeled, its windows clouded with frost. The street is quiet now, the funeral home across the road long abandoned. If you press your hand against the cold glass, you can see the faint outline of a chair by the window, where a man once sat each morning watching the river move. No one lives there anymore. Yet sometimes neighbors swear they see a light flicker inside. As if someone just stood up. Just turned to leave. Stefano Magaddino has been gone for half a century, and yet in Buffalo he never really left. He exists in fragments, in a ledger no one can find, in the smell of lilies at a funeral, in the soft footstep of someone who still locks their door twice before bed. His empire dissolved long ago, but its shape remains faintly visible, like the outline of a ship that sank just below the surface. Old men at diners still tell the story. They lean forward over their coffee, lower their voices, and say, "The Undertaker ran this town once." Then they smile, the kind of smile that isn't sure whether to fear or admire. Each has their own version. Some claim he buried gold under the falls. Others say he could stop a man's heart just by saying his name. No one agrees on the details. But they all agree on this. He never raised his voice. In that way the story lives on, not through the crimes or the money, but through the quiet. Silence, it turns out, leaves a deeper mark than noise. The FBI's files, boxed and brittle, rest now in federal archives. Hundreds of pages of half-truths and unanswered questions. The agents who once hunted him are gone, their notes fading, their evidence incomplete. The Bureau never caught the Undertaker because there was nothing to catch. He'd been built from the same material as the river, always present, never held. Decades later, graduate students and historians visit Buffalo searching for traces. They wander the old docks, the basements beneath churches, the tunnels rumored to connect one side of the border to the other. They take photographs of cracked stone, record the sound of dripping water, and ask old residents what they remember. The residents always answer the same way. He was a quiet man. Sometimes that's all history really is. A single sentence, whispered often enough to become eternal. At night, the Niagara Falls still roars as it always did. A voice older than language. Tourists stand at the railing, feeling the mist on their faces, not knowing that somewhere beneath their feet once ran the veins of an invisible kingdom. If they close their eyes, they might think they hear something other than water. The faint hum of engines, the roll of barrels on damp stone, the murmur of men speaking in Sicilian behind locked doors. But when they open their eyes, there is only the mist, and the endless, patient current. Buffalo itself has softened. The city learned to live without fear, to forgive the ghosts that built it. Where smuggling routes once crossed the border, bridges now glow with colored lights. Families picnic where warehouses once hid contraband. And yet, at night, when fog drifts in from the river, the air still carries a hush, as though the city remembers what it once promised not to tell. In a small museum downtown, a glass case holds a single black fedora, its brim wide, its lining faded. The label beneath reads, "Donated anonymously. Believed to belong to Stefano, the Undertaker Magaddino." Visitors stop, read the note, and move on. Few realize they're standing in front of something that once carried a nation's silence. To most it's just a hat. To the river it's a memory returning home. And so the story of the silent empire becomes what all stories eventually become. Not a warning, not a lesson, but a lullaby. A slow song for a city that learned to sleep again. Because every legend, no matter how dark, ends the same way. In quiet. Sometimes in late winter when the wind moves the right way. You can stand on the riverbank and hear a rhythm beneath the water. Steady, deliberate, like footsteps pacing under stone. Maybe it's the echo of hidden tunnels. Maybe it's the Undertaker himself, walking the old paths, counting debts no one remembers. Or maybe it's just the river doing what it has always done, keeping secrets. The Niagara flows on, untroubled, carrying away the last of the snow, the last of the whispers, the last of the men who thought they could control it. And if you listen long enough, you might hear its message, soft but certain. All empires fade. Only the water remains. The river remembers everything. The rumble of trucks across the bridge. The laughter in forbidden bars. The prayers of wives lighting candles for men who would never come home. It remembers the silence of the Undertaker, and the sound that silence made when it finally broke. And somewhere deep beneath its surface, where light cannot reach and sound cannot rise, the current still moves in the shape of a name. Steady, patient, eternal. Magaddino.